My name is Father Philip, and myself and Father Jeffrey have been working for a couple of years before COVID, and of course COVID sort of shut us down for a while, and in terms of reviving the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius here in Toronto. There was a chapter for many years, and then it sort of went into abeyance for a while, and so we're working to revive this St. Alban and St. Sergius, which since the 1930s has been helping Anglicans and Orthodox to celebrate together and to come to know each other a little more in the faith and to share something of our faith and our life together. And so we're hoping that we can continue to build this fellowship over the years. And the other thing to be thinking about, of course, is that we are in the week of prayer for Christian unity. And so it's just a joy that we're able to be here, Sister Elizabeth and the sisters here, and hosting us at the convent. We did, I think, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago, before COVID, we were here.
2020, I think.
Yeah, we were here as well. So it's nice to be able to be back again. If you'd like to know about future events and to be invited to them of the fellowship, there is a sheet at the back on that little table. And please put your name and email address so we could put you on the list and make sure that you hear about future events and services and things that happen with the fellowship. So thanks again to the sisters for hosting us today, and thank you particularly for Father Jeffrey and the gang coming to sing Vespers for us. It was quite wonderful. And Father Jeffrey is now going to introduce our speaker for the evening.
May I add to what Father Philip has just said about welcoming everyone. It's marvelous to be back here always and to be praying here and to be sharing from our traditions together. As Father Philip mentioned, there was many years ago a Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius chapter in Toronto, and luminaries as great as Father Alexander Schmerman and Father John Meyendorf were known to come to Toronto, to the university, and to give presentations. So I told that to Kiro after I had asked him to come and speak. Because I knew that having known that, he would have said, no, not me. So Kiro feels ill-equipped, but he's not, let me assure you. Most of the introduction of him ought to be visual, and you're going to see that in a moment, because Kyrillos Kelada, iconographer from the Coptic tradition, and if I'm allowed to have them, one of my favorite students at Trinity, is really an accomplished master in the visual medium. And so I think if you retain anything tonight, it's going to be some very beautiful images. He's a bit nervous about what he wants to say, but I think the images will speak for themselves, each of them 1,000 words or more. So Kiro is from Mississauga. He has been involved in iconography for many years now, has been training with different masters, and has been involved in the painting of various churches here and as far away as California and places, which is exciting. And he finished his design and art degree at OCAD in 2020, and since then has been a student at Trinity College in the MTS program. So I've had the privilege of teaching him many times now and learning from him. And I always get the pleasure of getting myself off the hook of having to mark one more essay, because I can always turn to him and say, by the way, you could do a creative project instead. They're easier to mark and more enjoyable to look at, I can tell you that. So he's going to show you one of those, at least, I think, in this presentation. So without further ado, my good friend, Kiro.
Thank you, Father, for your very kind introduction. I'm not used to being on this side of this dynamic. Usually it's me sitting down and Father's up here, and I'm asking what you would probably agree are way too many questions. But it's an honor to be here and to present what I hope will be a very exciting topic, which I think you guys are going to find has a lot of applications in our world today. Thank you also to the Sisters of St. John Convent for hosting us, and I hope you enjoy. And Father advised me to take this approach, which was always taken by our late professor Richard Schneider of blessed memory, which was to just put up pictures and then have people talk about them. So I'll give some content and some information, but after that, you guys are welcome to have this kind of back and forth, and hopefully we're all gonna learn something together. So, as Father said, I am an iconographer in the Coptic Orthodox Church, and the Coptic Orthodox Church today is the heir of a very long and diverse tradition, which goes all the way back to the days when Saint Mark was preaching in Alexandria in the 1st century. And since then, there's been a lot of different periods of Roman, Byzantine rule, and later on Persian, followed by Arab rule, and then Ottoman and French and British. Basically, there is nobody that the Copts have not dealt with. And I mean, that's had some positive effects and also some negative ones. But what I hope to show you today is really the most beautiful aspects that were produced by all of this history. This is probably one of the most famous pieces of Coptic iconography. And I've also brought some books, which you guys will be able to take a look at later. And one of them is a catalog of the Red Monastery, which is the biggest sort of masterpiece of liturgical art that is still completely intact in Egypt, all the way back from the 5th century and recently restored and published. This is from the monastery of Abba Apollo in Bawit, and this is the apse of a church. So this is what would have been behind the altar and what the priest would have been looking at, and the congregation of monks most likely as they were praying. It depicts Christ in glory, and beneath him the Mother of God and the apostles, which can be considered a variation on the ascension scene, in which the church altogether looks to Christ's ascension after his passion, resurrection, and awaits as well his second coming, and all those things are brought together in that single liturgical moment. This is my work, just for a little bit of context. So this was the assignment that I did for Father Jeffrey. It was for a class entitled "Salvation is of the Jews," where we were looking at some of the relationship and dialogue over the years between Christianity and Judaism. And so the goal of this icon was to show Christ in his most Jewish aspects, to show Christ as one who came not to destroy, but to fulfill the law. And he becomes the embodiment of Torah here. And I forgot to add this in the slides, but this is heavily inspired by the synagogue of Dura Europos, which surprisingly is a 2nd century synagogue in Syria, which has a full iconographic program, much like what you would expect to find in an Orthodox church. And there aren't many examples of this. But it sort of presents to us an example in which Jewish people were actually very comfortable with iconography. I put up this icon as well, and I was quite happy with this one, but I especially wanted to put it up in this presentation because it's currently sitting at an Episcopalian church down in Texas. And I have always been very, very fascinated by the facility with which Anglicans in particular, and more recently Catholics, have been able to take sacred art from a variety of different traditions and incorporate all of these things into worship. And I noticed as I was walking in the diversity of traditions of sacred art that you guys have decorating your beautiful convent. This one is put up in a little shrine that they created for youth in particular, because they wanted the youth of the church to learn to approach God First, by removing the concerns of the world, just as Moses takes off his sandals. This is St. Ignatius of Antioch and the Nativity, which we as Copts celebrated quite recently, and we actually celebrated the Theophany yesterday because apparently we're still 12 days behind the rest of the world. Now, I'm going to jump right into our topic, and in order to understand some of these relationships between Coptic and Celtic iconographic traditions, we need to understand how deeply rooted the ties are between both monastic traditions. Now, I need to make something clear. My goal in presenting these comparisons is not to argue any kind of causality or intentionality. In that sense, it would require a lot more research to be able to say these Celtic people definitely saw Coptic works and were inspired by them, or the opposite. But the commonality is still quite striking, and it can just serve to show how closely tied or how similar really both visual traditions are. So monasticism begins in Egypt with Anthony the Great, and he goes out into the desert during the 4th century. He forsakes the world, and his life is written by Athanasius, Patriarch of Alexandria. And then later on in the 5th century, St. John Cassian comes from the west and visits Egypt and really kind of does this proper research to document everything that the monks are up to in the Egyptian desert. So the way that they dress, the way that they eat, their schedule for prayers, spiritual advice as well. And he documents that in his 2 books, the Institutes and the Conferences, which are both translated in English. And he goes and founds communities in Europe based on what he learns from the Egyptian monks. And one of the monks who grows and develops in one of these communities in the south of France is none other but St. Patrick. And St. Patrick later on goes and preaches in Ireland, and he is known as the evangelizer, can we say that, of Ireland, of the Irish people. There's also some evidence, but not much, of an early Coptic presence in Ireland. So there are these legendary Coptic monks who are said to precede St. Patrick and who travel the Mediterranean and go on mission to preach Christianity in Ireland. In some circles, they're known as the 7 Coptic monks. We don't know too much more about that history. And as a result, the monasticism that develops in the British Isles has a very Egyptian character and flavor. There's a desire to go to the most secluded places, monasteries and communities in these areas in Iona, Lindisfarne, Northumbria. These places all have monasteries that are self-governing. They have independent abbots, and the monks in these areas become very influential on the piety of the people as well. And this becomes very elaborate with monastic rules and work and things of that sort. Now, just to give you an idea, this is what is known now as the cave of St. Anthony himself. And it's been a pilgrimage place for all sorts of Christians for a long time. It's in the in the eastern desert of Egypt by the Red Sea. And you can take steps now all the way up the mountain. It takes about an hour and a half or so to walk all the way up, and you can attend liturgy inside the cave, which is very tight, by the way. This only fits a single person. And you go in through a very tight corridor, and then inside the cave, there's a wider open space, which now has an altar. And when you go and you see the height of the mountains and the beauty of the desert landscape, it really makes sense that this would be the place where monasticism started. In the Irish context, we have the monastery of Skellig Michael, which is an island that is very remote and quite dangerous to get to. And you can see a similarity in the austerity of both places, kind of seeking out the worst possible place to go. And that's where they are wanting to go in order to worship God alone. But this austerity doesn't permeate everything. The austerity gets balanced with a lot of artwork and a lot of beauty, which we're going to be looking at today. So you can see that what the desert is for the Egyptians, the sea is for the Celtic monks. And it's very clearly reflected in the iconography. Here, the desert becomes a sacred space. Over there, the water and the islands and the cliffs become the sacred space. Now, when I was looking for different commonalities, I think the place where I found the most common ground was in manuscripts. And do the Celts have a vibrant manuscript tradition? Now, this is a Western monk sitting and working on a manuscript, and this is a photo of a Coptic monk in a very old manuscript library in the 1930s. And there's this really important emphasis on books. And by the way that we bind books was invented by the Copts. And if you go to Indigo, you can. I went once and I found a journal, like a notebook, and I noticed that it was bound with individual folios that were sewn together. So I checked the back and it said that it was Coptic binding. So that's one thing people still give Copts credit for, along with the invention of falafel, by the way, in case anybody was wondering. So there is this huge emphasis on the book. And this is a photo from the same photographer who took photos of the monks in St. Anthony's Monastery in the 1930s. And this is a Coptic manuscript. And you can see the beautiful ornamented crosses. By that time, of course, these manuscripts are being created in both Coptic and Arabic because Coptic is slowly phased out until it remains only in the context of liturgy and a few remote villages by this time. Now, we have this masterpiece from the Celtic tradition, which is the Book of Kells. And I would say that looking at something like the Book of Kells, what you get is an even more elaborate version of some of this ornamentation. And it just makes you wonder why. Because these books are either Gospels or Psalters or liturgy books. They're meant to be read. And so we might think that this kind of goes against the function of such a book. But it's clear here that they're not just meant to be read, they're also meant to be looked at. This is also from the Book of Kells. And you can see here the degree to which the ornamentation is so elaborate. And this is just one page from an entire volume. You can imagine how many, maybe weeks this must have taken. And here we start to see some overlap in both traditions. There's this very clear emphasis on these braided patterns. And we're going to see how this starts to acquire spiritual meaning for the monks, in most cases, that are producing them. This is from a Coptic book of the four Gospels. There's a cross like this one that appears in the beginning of each of the Gospels, along with an icon of the particular evangelist. And this Gospel is quite famous, by the way. If anybody wants to take note, it's BNF Copt 13, BNF being Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And this is the biggest fully illustrated Coptic Gospel that we have. But you can see that these braided patterns and this ornamentation, with an emphasis on animals, on floral patterns, also appears in the wall paintings that the Copts are making. This is from the monastery of Bawit in Middle Egypt. And here I thought this resemblance was really, really kind of mesmerizing to look at, because you've got a twisting of the pattern just in the same way as you can see with this beautiful capital from the Book of Kells. And I'm not sure if I put it in the slides or not, but we also have in Coptic manuscripts these big capitals which open every chapter of a book. Here are two panels that are doing the same thing in a gospel book. It's presenting the four gospels and the four evangelists who are sort of surrounding the cross or surrounding Christ. And it's fitting that we celebrated the cross in Vespers, because the way that the cross is decorated is clearly one of the things that is most valuable to the people who are decorating these manuscripts, both Celts and Copts. Here, the person who created this is opting more for the figures of the four incorporeal creatures, while in the Coptic example, we have individual icons of the four evangelists, and you can see that Christ is right up there between the two icons, topped off by a cross, and the braided patterns and decorations all around. You can see another commonality here where the icons of the Copts, like the Celtic iconography, can get quite flat and abstract at times. So whereas the Byzantine tradition, for example, is very steeped in a more naturalistic tradition of Greco-Roman painting, and of course this is all relative, because I know that a lot of Orthodox might not like to hear that Byzantine tradition is realistic, but it's more realistic in comparison with this, and I mean that's a whole can of worms that we're not going to open today. Suffice to say that the flatness and the concern with symbolism is what predominates in these works. This is another Celtic gospel, and this braided pattern comes up as well in Coptic stonework. So you have these beautiful, what they call basket capitals, that appear in Egypt in late antiquity. And once again, there's a sense in which none of this is necessary. It really is a work of love. Now we're going to look at stonework. So there's a big tradition of Coptic funerary stelae, and we can see how that overlaps with Celtic tomb crosses. Now the Copts don't have a strong tradition of carved crosses the way that you might see in Armenia, for example, where the stone cross, it's called a khachkar, and that is basically what Armenian cemeteries look like. It's several sort of stone crosses. So maybe that would have actually been a more fitting comparison for these for the Celtic stone crosses. But here you can also see the way in which these carved patterns overlap, and trying to give a sense that it's like a braided work. These are some more Coptic examples from that same gospel, and this is not even like the words of the gospel. This is just this is a clarification or a rubric, I think, about the canon that's being presented. And within these braided patterns, you've got these crosses as well. Here, once again, you have this big, not a capital in this case, but a single word beginning the manuscript. This says in Coptic, the book. This is sort of what I was talking about in terms of the iconography being very flat and abstract, and the lack of concern for naturalism. All of the main features here have been very abstracted and reduced. And by the way, the interesting thing about this manuscript is that it's actually contemporary to the Book of Kells. Both are from the 800s. This is in the Morgan Library in the United States, and you can see how the folds of the clothing have been reduced simply to lines and patterns here as well. Even the physical features of the Virgin Mary have been very, very abstracted in this schematic way. You can see the way that her breasts are depicted. And the one in the Book of Kells doesn't go this far, but in the Coptic one, we have the nursing virgin. So her breast is out, and she is feeding the child Jesus. This icon is one of the most important icons in Coptic tradition. If you walk into a Coptic church today, you're probably not going to see it. It's fallen out of usage, and why that's the case could be a subject of great discussion. But between the 5th and 8th centuries in Egypt, I would have to say that about 90% of icons of the Virgin Mary that are extant are the nursing virgin depicted this way. And they're doing this long before it gets taken up in the medieval and Renaissance of the West. Of course, it's not sensual at all. It's very abstracted, and that sort of creates a sense of hierarchy and focus. It's not trying to show you the details of the body of the Virgin Mary, but it's trying to show you that the one who feeds the whole world held to the Virgin Mary's breast and was fed by her. So it's creating this contrast, and this appears also a lot in Coptic hymns. You can see how the composition is the same as well, with the Virgin Mary flanked by 2 angels, and here they've added 2 angels at the bottom, and they're set up as courtiers. And this is the sort of traditional composition all across the Mediterranean for the enthroned Virgin, at least pre-iconoclasm. Now, we were talking about crosses, and now we move to the Lindisfarne Gospels, which have more of these crosses and what we call these carpet pages. And a carpet page is something that appears in manuscripts of all traditions. Even Qurans are very famous, illuminated Qurans, for these carpet pages with different motifs. And once again, you can see how elaborate things are here, but this level of ornamentation gets taken up in the apse, actually, of a Coptic monastery, which is not very popular. It's not a very well-known center for pilgrimage, but it's called the Monastery of Abu Fana. And here in the apse, instead of having a Christ in glory, as you would normally expect in Coptic tradition, what you have instead is this very elaborately decorated cross. And when I go to the next slide, you're going to see the striking resemblance that this has with all of the Celtic stuff that we've been looking at so far. So here, all figurative iconography is almost dispensed with, and what we have instead is this beautiful cross with hanging drapes, which might allude to a holy place, the sanctuary, or at the very least, it's a liturgical allusion. And then you have all of these individual patterns which surround the cross. And when you look at it at first, it's quite striking, and we're not too sure what we're supposed to do with that visually. But there's a sense of order in the chaos that takes place here. And here I'm just thinking out loud, we might think about the chaos which takes place before creation. And that in creation, God breathes order into the world. And he makes things logikos, according to the logos. And so here, it feels very chaotic, but there's also this beautiful order which keeps the whole thing very organized and makes in the end for a very striking and I would say prayerful liturgical space.
So because the abstractions on both sides aren't symmetrical, and Egypt was center of astronomy, has anyone ever considered this might be a night sky? Crosses. I mean, it looks like the heavens, the starry heavens.
That's a really interesting point. Art historians consider roundels with a cross in the sky to sometimes be an allusion to the vision of Constantine. Now, this, I believe, is a medieval painting, so I think by that time, the memory of Constantine's achievements may not be as important of a factor in Coptic piety, but the image remains. So you have this roundel with a cross in it all over Europe. If you go to Ravenna, I believe it's at Saint Apollinar, you have this cross that appears in the sky, and it is surrounded by stars. So this could very well be a cross appearing in what would be, in this period, some sort of depiction, maybe even just of the order of the cosmos. I have no idea. It's a very compelling hypothesis.
This was medieval. Would there have been influence from Islam to move away from presentation of human figures?
That's also a difficult question, because these highly ornamented examples of iconography in a lot of cases appear side by side with traditional iconographic Christian depictions. That being said, what does end up happening, so the overall arc of Coptic art history ends up moving towards more ornamentation and less wall painting. So in the churches of the 17th and 18th century, which are the most famous examples are now in Cairo, instead of the magnificent head-to-toe wall-painted churches that the Copts had in late antiquity, what you have instead is churches that are decorated with ornamentation top to bottom, and then little wooden icons in frames that are just hanging as individual objects all around the space. Why that might be the case is the subject of probably much longer research. I would also say that the Copts never shied away from adopting the artistic vernacular of the society that they were in. So if you go to a Mamluk era Coptic church and go to a mosque of the same period, the style of woodwork which decorates the mimbar in the mosque is the same sort of craftsmanship which decorates, in most cases, the iconostasis of those Coptic churches and the Torah shrine of contemporary synagogues too, by the way. And if you go to Old Cairo, you can actually see an example of a church, a mosque, and a synagogue that are walking distance from each other. And when you visit the three of them on the same day, it's so striking the amount of artistic features which they share, because they're just contemporaneous with each other. So there's a lot of Coptic manuscripts that if you flip through them, at first glance you might think that it was a Quran until you read the content. In many cases also, patterns that are used in the Islamic context are adapted to look a bit more cross-like, let's say, whereas in mosques you might have an eight-pointed star and things like that. Actually, many of our Coptic churches today still preserve, even here in the GTA, still use Mamluk era Islamic eight-pointed stars, but the Copts just placed a cross right in the middle, just as an identity marker, right? I mean, the Copts have this tradition. It's hard to know where exactly it came from. There's a couple of different narratives about why it started, but of tattooing the cross on their wrists as this kind of identity marker. And even today, in a lot of places for security, when you're going to enter a church, for safety, they sometimes check your wrist to see whether or not you're Coptic, and this plays into all kinds of dynamics of systemic discrimination in Egypt against Copts and persecution and things like that. This is what I was saying about the consistency of the roundel with the cross in it. It has these same braided patterns that we see time and time again in the Celtic works, and there's also here a very heavy emphasis on animals. So you've got all of these animals that are symbolic for different things. Sometimes you can't really tell what the animals are. Here, these are probably peacocks, and they're holding what appears to be little oil lamps, or they could be censers as well. And it's this image of the cross in paradise, and the peacock is a late antique symbol of immortality. This is in the nave of the Red Monastery, which you guys can flip through the catalog of the Red Monastery later. It's really kind of this big church where the nave is intact and the sanctuary is in a wonderful state of preservation. And if you want to go see it, it's an 8-hour train from Cairo. Once again, very Celtic-looking braided patterns. And here we have these deer, also from the same church, by the way. So that church has just a series of large crosses. This cross is probably about my height or bigger, and it's high up on the nave. So these are really these big monumental crosses that appear all over Egypt, not in carved stone, but in this case in wall painting. For contemporary Copts, this takes a little bit of a shift. It would need more research to document exactly when this idea developed, but in the modern period, the Copts took a simpler version of the braided crosses that we saw earlier. And now it can be set to a grid. And so if you have like grid paper, and you understand the forms, it's very easy for anyone to be able to produce these cross patterns with quite a bit of freedom of modifying the forms. This cross is called a iota cross. Iota being the first letter of the name of Jesus, both in Greek and in Coptic by extension. And the iotas are these little white units. Like I said, this doesn't go back as far as the earlier traditions that I've shown you, but this is how it's presented today. So somewhere at some point, someone looked at these braided crosses and said, gee, this looks an awful lot like the letter I. And so to draw these units repeatedly and understanding them as the first letter of the name of Jesus makes these iota crosses a kind of contemporary visual Jesus prayer. And a lot of people have been learning this craft, which is relatively straightforward, and it's also been brought into the digital space. So that in some of the monasteries now, especially in the monastery of El Baramos, which is the monastery of St. Maximus and Domitius in the Western Desert, there was a particular monk there who did lots of research on this and who set out to revive this craft, but the monks started to reproduce these digitally and have them laser engraved on plaques of wood. And then the monks will take those laser engraved works on wood and paint them and color them manually. So it's being revived in a sort of different form now, but still as a form of contemplative monastic work. This is a iota cross, which is actually here in Toronto. You can go see it at the at the Coptic Museum of Canada, which is in St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Church in Scarborough. And this cross is about this tall, and it was created by Pope Macarius III in the 19th century when he was still a monk as part of his monastic obedience. And he produced this beautiful set of crosses with Coptic texts in watercolor. At the end, I'll give you guys some details about the Coptic Museum of Canada so that you guys can book a time to go visit and check it out if you would like. Now, I want to sort of tie this all together with a quotation from Father Alexander Schmemann in his work For the Life of the World. He talks about liturgical beauty and the idea of necessity. And he says, unnecessary it is indeed, for we are beyond the categories of the necessary. Beauty is never necessary, functional, or useful. And when expecting someone whom we love, we put a beautiful tablecloth on the table and decorate it with candles and flowers. We do all this not out of necessity, but out of love. This is from For the Life of the World. So this work of love is something that we've lost in our modern age to a very strong emphasis on function. We wonder first whether a thing is practical, whether a thing is useful. But what we can try to retrieve in these beautiful traditions, both in the Coptic tradition and the Celtic tradition, is to return to this idea of a labor of love. And this is something that we can take outside of our churches and present to our contemporary society. As I said before, manual work was always a big, important part of monastic culture. These are more photos of St. Anthony's Monastery from the 1930s. The traditional work of the monks, by the way, in Egypt was taking palm branches and using them to weave baskets. But here, this monk is very happily knitting away. And in this case, I believe this is the same monk actually, they are baking holy bread to celebrate the liturgy. And during the COVID pandemic, a lot of people took up baking, and a lot of people took up knitting, and people started to find all of these hobbies of manual labor, of manual work, in some cases very repetitive, like knitting or these manuscript illuminations. A lot of it must have been very repetitive work. But there's something very meditative and therapeutic about that. And the moment that the world shut down and we were stuck at home, as monks, as ascetics, people went back to this tradition of manual labor in a variety of forms. Now, if you go on Indigo and you look up adult coloring books, you'll find a variety of, yes, forgive me for being a bit crude. I thought this one was quite funny. But this sort of presents the desire that people have to be alone, to spend some time alone, and to work on something manual. Now, of course, in our case as Christians, the object of that meditation and the object of that manual labor is the contemplation of the Holy Trinity. And like I said, there's a variety of ways in which we can take this back up into our modern world. In the Orthodox world, we kind of just think about prayer ropes. Like prayer ropes are the thing, and if you want to learn this discipline, then you can learn how to make prayer ropes, or you can learn how to make icons, but that's just about it. But each person sort of spending time with God in the way that is totally personal and unique to them will be able to find a labor of love which they can offer to Jesus Christ. This is a project that I'm working on currently. It's a retranslation of the Midnight Psalmody of the Coptic Orthodox Church. And I'm working on the iconography, not on these mandalas. We have a graphic designer named Jessica Ayad from Australia who is working on digitizing many of these ancient mandala or ornamented designs. This, by the way, for those who are asking, it is a very heavily Islamic-looking carpet page, but it's from a liturgy book. And you can see how it gets adapted by playing with the patterns so that it's a cross as this marker of identity. This is another example of the work that she's done, taking these ancient forms and bring them into a digital space to try to see how this kind of stuff can enhance our experience of the Midnight Psalmody today. Not in medieval Egypt, but in a Coptic parish here in Toronto or in New York or wherever it happens to be. And then in the future, this could probably lead to a more elaborate creative form of this, where we start to create new designs and things like that. This is what I've done so far in terms of the iconography that's going to be in the psalmody. And my goal is to sort of try to look at the tradition of Coptic manuscript illuminations and to see what elements can be adapted for contemporary usage. If you guys remember the Nursing Virgin from the 800s, that's sort of what this is inspired by, but also informed by the contemporary Coptic school of icon painting. This was a project which did not go through, but is still worth showing, it's been modified at Trinity College. So a donation was made to include icons in the Lady Chapel at Trinity College, and initially it was supposed to be some icons hung on the wall for use in Orthodox services. And Father Jeffrey actually brought this up to me at the very beginning of my time in the MTS program, and there's still nothing on that wall. So, no, we still have some work to do. It's been through a variety of different iterations, but when I saw the beauty of the space, this beautiful kind of British-looking architecture from the 1950s, and it's this beautiful sort of Gothic building, I said it would be a shame not to at least try to propose a wall painting. So I did. There were concerns about installing anything permanent in the space, so that did not go through, but it really got me thinking about how there can be common ground that's found in both traditions. This is a proposal for Coptic iconography in an Anglican building. And the whole conversation was, okay, well, how can we make it look as though the initial architect who had designed this building would have been happy to have that work there? So we started to look at some of the traditions of Celtic and Coptic iconography and traditions in between, such as the Romanesque, especially the Romanesque actually, which bears a lot in common with both Celtic and Coptic iconography, and to see what we could do. So this Vesica Pisces shape doesn't appear very much in the late antique Coptic forms of the Pantocrator, which I showed you guys. It's actually very Romanesque. And this composition of a deisis appears maybe once or twice in the extant Coptic works that we have. And putting it all into this geometric shape, and the plan was to have some of this ornamentation from Celtic tradition all around the major shapes of the icon. That would be kind of something that is Coptic, but that feels at home in a space like this. One of the things that's happening a lot right now is that there's still a lot of immigration of Copts from Egypt to Western countries. And this creates a lot of new communities, and in many cases, these communities can't afford to build new buildings. But what often ends up happening is that they end up repurposing buildings from Western churches. And one of the things that really upsets me about the way that this happens is that often Copts will enter into a space like this and assume that it bears nothing in common with their liturgical tradition. So they'll start adding Coptic elements, an iconostasis, an altar, whatever, without thinking about how what's already there can be a part of Coptic liturgy. And so it's a whole area of research which I'm looking forward to, and a couple of people are working on now to see how we should approach the creation of sacred space which we have not built as Copts, and how to do that in a way which respects the Western heritage in which we are entering, and in which we are ultimately continuing the same activity, which is the entrance into the kingdom and partaking of the flesh and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you very much, and you're welcome to ask any questions. Yes.
So what about the first icon that you showed on the first slide? So you mentioned that there's the apostles, but I counted 14 men.
Right. Fantastic observation. This is something that I love about Coptic iconography. There is never a cut and dry historicism about, this is an event, who was there, this is what you would have seen had you been there. The two people at the extremities are actually local saints who would have been local to the monastic community in which this was painted. And they're dressed like the apostles.
Right.
So what that means is that there isn't like a space of time or of location
Right.
between us here and the kingdom of God. The activity of liturgy is an entrance into the kingdom now. So these two saints, who were monks in the local community, are gathered around the Virgin Mary with the apostles and are standing before the throne of God. And this appears a lot in Coptic tradition. I would actually say that this is sort of the archetype for the traditional Coptic apse, where you've got Christ on top, the Virgin Mary below, right? In Byzantine tradition, the way that this plays out is that instead of having Christ on top and the Virgin below in the apse, because it's a basilica, there's no dome, in the Byzantine tradition what you get is that the Virgin becomes the whole apse, and then Christ becomes the Pantocrator in the dome, right? So it's the same sort of thing that's going on. An image of the Ascension and of the Second Coming at the same time. And that also supports, what we were talking about, right? Because at the Second Coming, it's not just the Virgin and the Apostles. The saints and all of us are joining as well. So we have this part in liturgy about, therefore, as we commemorate your holy passion, resurrection, ascension, and sitting at the right hand of the Father, we offer to you your gifts from what is yours, right? So it's in this commemoration of all those things, it's in that space where we offer the gifts. And there's an apse from this area where I haven't done enough research on this yet, and I don't think anybody has. It's an old photo. It's probably like a lot of Coptic archaeology is like they excavated the stuff, photographed it, and then buried it back under the sand because there was no place to take it. So it's actually better preserved under the sand. Although some things have disintegrated and whatever. Anyways, you have Christ enthroned, and you have two people bringing something that looks like a plate to him and the chalice on the other side. And they're dressed like these apostles. I'm convinced that it's Peter and Paul. And they're there and they're participating in the liturgy by offering at the throne of God his gifts from what is his.
Is Matthias in there instead of Judas? I can't read.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right, because again, this is not a historical account. This is the fulfillment of all things.
So that would have to include Matthias.
Yes.
Judas. Okay.
Yeah.
I have one comment and one question. The comment is having to do with maybe sometimes we tend to overcorrect when we talk about beauty in church and beauty in general, that it doesn't have to be utilitarian primarily, and it doesn't have to be useful. It's beauty for the sake of beauty. Except often when we do add something beautiful, it's not without purpose. And I'm reminded, especially since you showed so many manuscripts, of Mary Carruthers' book, The Book of Memory, where she actually points out that people didn't memorize texts. They memorized, in the abstract, they memorized specific texts. They memorized not Psalm 134 that, all you servants of the Lord, praise the Lord, and then Psalm 135, give thanks to the Lord for his good, and then Psalm 136, by the waters of Babylon. They memorized on the page with the two peacocks on top. Oh, you servants of the Lord, bless you the Lord. And then the one with the giant basket woven cross motif. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, and then by the waters of Babylon, the one with the rivers. There was a functionality about which the beauty was part of. But it could have been anything, but they chose something specific and beautiful. So there's a balance between those two things, which I think sometimes we forget. We want one or the other. It's like a dualism that we somehow can't get over. We want functionality or we want the beauty, but they do together. But the question I had was, if you go back to where you're showing us the iota crosses, I was thinking about all the various media you showed us, and couldn't help but notice that also works as a cross-stitch pattern. So what was the effect?
Yes.
What happens to textiles, which are far easier to transport than manuscripts, than icons? Because you can't put scroll work into a cross-stitch, but you can put a cross that has all the elements in a simplified form that actually come up with a similar vibe.
These contemporary iota crosses appear all over priest and deacon's vestments today.
Okay. How old did the textile versions of those happen? You know?
That's hard to say, because we actually don't have a lot of early vestments that are extant. There's a couple of examples in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, but there isn't enough for us to be able to say, here is a kind of pattern or canon of, Coptic vestment decoration, whatever it is, right? And the earliest Coptic textiles, by the way, which is like, if you go on Google Images and just write Coptic textiles, you could be scrolling for hours. It's absolutely magnificent. But even with those early textiles, we can never tell if these are for liturgical use or not. And there's some debate about that, and Stephen Davis writes a little bit about that in one of his books. Anyways, I want to say it probably dates to things being done on machines. Unless maybe the early 20th century vestments, which at the time, and towards the middle of the 20th century, Coptic vestments are starting to kind of acquire their own character and also be very high in quality. My chanter's tunic has a cross like that, and so now everything is done with machines. So there isn't really this sense of handcrafted works with a lot of stuff.
Are you saying that the Coptic convents aren't busy making all this like their Greek convents? Right?
Well, it is the convents actually, but they're constantly opting for very fast and efficient work. So there is a danger here of kind of losing that labor of love, and there's a big question mark on what kind of visual influences are informing how vestments are being created, because if even today, like the older Coptic priests who have vestments from like the 70s and 80s that they're still wearing, those vestments are still in excellent shape, and they're quite beautiful. The more contemporary Coptic vestments are starting to get a little bit tacky, and there's a lot of mixes of different mediums that really shouldn't be there, and even elements of print sometimes. So it's just, the Copts are the largest religious minority in the Middle East. There are 100 million Egyptians, there's about 10 million Copts in Egypt alone. And the diaspora, the Coptic diaspora now is starting to become very, very significant. And they produce things for those people as well. So what's informing a lot of this stuff is mostly what is the flashiest thing that everybody will buy. There is a priest in Sydney who is trying to change some of that by making Coptic vestments in a Serbian workshop, actually. It's quite famous. Has anybody heard of Riza Vestments? Yeah. Okay, so there is now a Coptic branch of Riza Vestments in the same workshop where they make Coptic vestments with the same mediums and the same quality of stuff. That's Pivatos Vestments on Instagram. Yeah, anyway. Yes.
You mentioned a couple of saints who were like Mediterraneans who went west. I don't know if you've looked into that or not. Is there much evidence for like a greater cultural exchange? I grew up, I'm half Greek, half Celtic. And I grew up with a grandma who told me all these tales about seafarers from the Mediterranean who traded with the Cornish and all the rest of it, and how they brought stuff and they traded ideas back and forth. But I don't know whether that was just grandma's imagination or whether there's any evidence for that kind of thing. It's interesting because there's so much commonality, and it's like
Yeah, it's
they both,
amazing.
like they really, really tug.
I mean, Father Jeffrey sort of set me on this topic, and the more I've been reading in preparation for this talk, the more I want to learn more about this kind of thing, but it's not something that I know much about. So
Okay.
if you...
I think the best way to think about it is to realize that where today we see the water as the barrier between places, that was the highway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to go from Egypt or somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean to the British Isles was easier than traveling overland through the continent. So there was those kind of stories are absolutely true. We know about that trade. What Kira pointed out earlier, where there isn't a lot of information, is direct causality. This person arrived and brought this design, and therefore this was picked up. But all you can see is what we've been looking at tonight and say it had to have been there, right? There had to have been some, and maybe backwards and forwards. We don't just say it's just Coptic influence on the Celtic. It's the other way around as well. But we know from other archaeology that goods made in the Middle East were found in Ireland, and vice versa. So that's about the water being the joining thing, not the dividing thing that we think of it as. Right?
Well, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is most people think of Egypt as kind of this land of the pharaohs and things like that. Late antique and medieval Egypt is an extremely multicultural society. People are coming into Alexandria and into Cairo from all over the place. And then you get the Crusades, which also brings in a lot of art with it and things like that. So there's really a lot going on in Egypt in that period, and it could very well be that there may have been travelers from Western Europe in medieval Egypt. Okay, thank you very much.